Greetings, respected viewers. So this is a video about Israel and India, connections between the two countries. Now, at first blush, these two countries seem to be radically dissimilar. So India is the second largest country in the world in terms of population, and rather large in terms of land mass as well. I think I'm right in saying, is it the 10th in area? Whereas Israel is very, very small in area. I don't know where it is in the list of 193 or so sovereign states, depending what you define as a sovereign state. Slightly larger than Delaware, and population of only about 9 million. And yet they have quite a cordial relationship. They're both on the Asian continent. People in certain parts of the world say Asia, meaning the Far East. In the United States, they say similar to Asian. They mean that their origins would lie in China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, something like that. In the United Kingdom, when people talk about Asians, they often mean people whose ancestry lies in South Asia, as in the subcontinent. But Asia is really from Israel to Japan, from Siberia to Papua New Guinea. Anyway, so there is a minuscule Jewish community in India. So it is microscopically small. It wasn't as tiny until the late 20th century, by which time most Yehudim of Barat had performed Aliyah. Forgive me if I don't pronounce that correctly. I'm not conversant in Ivrit. So there is still a Jewish school in Kolkata. That's a city was known as Calcutta till the 90s. But almost none of the pupils there are Jewish, but nevertheless it bears the name. There were Cochi Jews in the extreme south of India. I've been into their synagogue, and obviously Indian Jews, their phenotype is more or less typically Indian. You might say, well, it's not absolutely clear what an Indian is supposed to look like, but in terms of, say, skin tone and facial features, they're as close to an average Indian as you can be, because of course there's been miscegnation over the centuries. Hindu Judaism was proselytizing in ancient Roman times. So the idea that Jews are the same ethnicity is really for the birds. You get Falasha Jews from Ethiopia who are definitely black, and you get some European Jews who are very white. It could be me, for example. And so obviously there's been plenty of intermarriage, and many Jews are Khazars, as in they're descendants of people who live by the Caspian Sea who converted in the Dark Ages, because Khazar is the name for the Caspian Sea in the lands around the Caspian littoral. So there was a Jewish community in Iraq since biblical times, and some of these Baghdadi Jews, they took ship for the great Portuguese city of Bombay as it became Mumbai, as it's been since 1998. I think Siegfried Sassoon was a descendant of one of those. Well, I'm not sure if his ancestors came to the United Kingdom via India, or did they come direct from Iraq? I'm unsure. So now India and Israel, they became independent within a year of each other. Obviously, India on the 15th day of August 1947, and Israel in 1948, that May, though I don't recall the actual date. So they're both born, or perhaps reborn, would be a better word, in the wake of the Second World War. But the situation was very different because, of course, 1/3 of world Jewry was annihilated in the space of just 3 years. But as I say, there are many striking differences between the two countries. So Palestine was also trying to become an independent country, I think for the very first time, really, being part of the empire or other, the Ottoman Empire or other polities for centuries prior to that. Palestine, peopled by Arabs, 90% of whom were Muslims, a few were Christians, and I suppose a handful of Jews had always resided there, despite the edict of expulsion from Roman Judea. Anyway, so India took up the cause of Palestinian nationalism, and the Palestinian Liberation Organization was recognized by the government of India and established a representative office in New Delhi. Mrs. Gandhi, that redoubtable woman, was Prime Minister of India from 1966 to 1977, and again from 1980 until her assassination in 1984. But she was a stalwart advocate of the right of self-determination of the much put upon and oppressed Palestinian people who'd been driven from post to pillar, who'd been pushed into lonely exile, and then and they were rotting away in often ghastly conditions in refugee camps in Palestine, Jordan, and elsewhere, but eventually became well integrated into these societies. So she was a close confidant of Yasser Arafat, who was chairman of the PLO for a long time. So Indira Gandhi saw this as a case of anti-colonialism, and thought that the Israelis had drave out the Palestinians. So she very much identified with them. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics took up the cause of the Palestinians, despite the Soviet Union having voted to create Israel in 1948. Partly, Stalin believed that there were many socialists and even communists amongst the Zionists, so there'd be a friendly pro-Soviet state giving a foothold in the Middle East. Araby was mostly fervently anti-communist at the time because they thought as anti-religious, which it largely was. And there's always been a tiny but somewhat influential Armenian community in India, because they are renowned traders, and Armenians voyaged all over the world. Remember, between India and Armenia, there's only one country, Iran. Remember that Armenia is part of Iran for a long time, and so some of these Armenians, they learnt the Persian language. They travelled to India, which of course included Pakistan until 1947, and being conversant in Persian, they could speak to some people in northern India, particularly some Muslims still spoke Persian. It's only in the 1830s that in North India, Persian was replaced as English as an official language. Of course, the Urdu language is Hindi with many Persian accretions, and that's the language of Pakistan and of some of the Muslims of North India. Anyway, 1990s came along, the Soviet Union was dissolved, and the Palestinians had lost their sugar daddy. Okay, they're backed by Syria. The other Arab states were still on their side, although they've been thrown to the wolves by almost every Arab country now. Their cause appears to be a forlorn hope. So then in the early 90s, India established diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, and they've cooperated most cordially. So then they do have common foes. Pakistan is, of course, India's nemesis, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and obviously it's got its Islamic Ideology Council to try to vet all legislation, see that it's in accordance with the Hadith and the Holy Quran and so forth. So there's quite a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric in Israel. Having said that, about 10% of Israeli citizens are Muslims, and they're growing. Oddly, it's the two opposite groups. It's the Muslims in Israel and the ultra-Orthodox Jews. It's the secular Jews tend to be, quite Western and have a very low fertility rate. So there's push is going to come to shove from Israel in about 50 years' time, when these Haredim and so on, who stay students permanently, particularly men, have about half a dozen children each and live on welfare. And how are you going to sustain the economy? As opposed to some of the Arab Israelis, half of whom are Muslim, the other Druze and Christians, who feel little loyalty to the idea of an ethno-state, the Jewish state. And as I say, being Jewish isn't really an ethnicity. I know it's heritable. Even those who don't believe in the Jewish faith might call themselves Jewish just because they